Okay, so welcome everybody again. My name is Stefano Feltri. I'm not an academic. Probably I'm not. I'm the only one here. I'm a journalist, and I work with a think tank at Bocconi University called the Institute for European Policy Making. And as the name suggests, we are focused on policy discussion like the one we are having here. And now, after the paper presentation, which I found personally extremely interesting, we are going to discuss exactly this. I mean, the policy implication of the dilemmas that you presented in the first part. I mean, the 28th regime sounds like a good idea, but that's not enough to make it works. So now we'll try to connect all the dots of the first part here in this round table, and the broad question we will address in different nuances is basically, can corporate law realistically become part of Europe's innovation architecture, and how this 28th regime can actually became truly effective and truly interesting for innovators, VC companies, and other players that actually prefer the real Delaware, not the fake one, and other jurisdictions. So this roundtable will not end the discussion. Then you will have a Q&A session moderated by Luca Enriques, because I have to go to another event. But first of all, let me introduce the speaker that will be part of this conversation. Rebecca Christie is a senior fellow at Bruegel. She is also a columnist at Reuters. She hosts a podcast. She is part of this Brussels bubble policy conversation, and Bruegel, you all know that it is at the center of it. José Garrido is the IMF Legal Department Supervisor Coordinator of the IMF insolvency work, and he will give the insolvency perspective, which is one of the most relevant one, as we heard in the first part. Vasco Pereira da Silva is a head of policy at Allied for Startups, with a background in public policy, and he is the one who will bring us the perspective of people who actually do innovation and just not discuss about it. And Giovanni Strampelli is a professor of business law at Bocconi and ECGI research member. And then we have Tobias Tröger, who is professor of private law and commercial and business law at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. And he's also the director of the LawFin Center and the Law and Financial Cluster at SAFE. Okay, so now let's start with the broader question. I ask each one of you to share his view. If you are all brief, so we have time for back and forth. Otherwise, we have to move to the next topic. So, apparently, this should be a useless question, but what problem should EU Inc. Actually trying to solve? Because this is not entirely clear, and we started this issue came out basically came out in every paper presentation. If we do not know what problem we are exactly trying to fix, probably the solution will not work. So I will start with Rebecca. Try to be as provocative as possible, as you do in your podcast, and I see in the chat that many other here listen to it.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to Tobias for being on the podcast for one of our most listened to episodes of the year, which for a topic like 28th regime is saying something. I love this opening question of what problem are we trying to solve? Because my fundamental issue with the Commission's EU Inc. proposal is that it's not trying to solve the right problem. 28th regime is a tool. It's been around for a long time. We started dropping it casually into conversation in finance world as a way to smooth over specifically financial market fragmentation and capital market fragmentations. This has been kicking around, for at least 10 years since Juncker and his commission rolled out the Capital Markets Union plan. And somewhere in the last, I would say 2 years, the capital markets part fell out. And while there's still an emphasis on startups and scale-ups, somebody got it in their head, I think aided by some lobbying that I'm not saying lobbying is bad. I'm just saying that it shaped the public attitude. Anyway, people started focusing on company formation and paperwork. So now we have a proposal to help you start a company and manage it with less paperwork and maybe be able to move around the EU a little more easily than you used to. And maybe that's fine. You all may have stronger opinions than I do. But I think the problem is getting the money from one place to another. And there are ways you could use the 28th regime tool to do that. And we may have more 28th regime sorts of things. We were talking today that the EU venture capital, the UVECA framework, is a type of 28th regime. So there's stuff out there, but EU Inc. in particular,
Okay, that's a good start. And so we move to Vasco Pereira da Silva. So from your perspective, what is exactly the problem they're trying to solve? Is just a matter of paperwork, or I mean, there are so many other issues that this is not. It's probably one of the tool in the toolbox, but not the right one, the main one probably.
First of all, thank you. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Well, this is indeed a good first question. Looking from the perspective of the startup organizations that are represented in Brussels, I think EU Inc. is seen, or this 28th regime is seen as a first building block. It's not was never meant to be a silver bullet. And indeed, I agree with Rebecca when she says there's a question on capital markets union, civil investment union, that is probably even a bigger problem to be solved. I think the discussion on the side of the startup community starts not so much on the question of incorporation or the creation of startups, but mostly on the scaling, because indeed, every time a startup, and these companies move really fast, when they start scaling across the EU, every time they step in a new member state, they have to start from zero. They have to incorporate again, and all the incorporation processes are different, the costs are different, the timings, and so on. So this is the issue for the startups, is the scaling. And of course, this is intimately linked with investment, because investors, and a lot of, or most startups are, as you know, VC-backed companies. And investors, when they do their risk assessment of the reality of each one of these European markets that are all divided, they don't trust it enough, and they will have to go through 27 company laws and other regimes to see if they're going to give money to these companies or not. And normally they will say, no, it's easier to go to markets where we know how things function better, so just come to the US. So this is probably the biggest issue. And I think this proposal is trying to partially address that. It's not going to cover everything. We still see it as a positive first step. I think we can't really discuss other parts that will also be important, let's say B2B contracts, insolvency, guarantees, loans, and all other this transactional layer without discussing the corporate law first. But again, not a silver bullet. I think it's a first building block.
Okay, thank you so much. And Tobias Tröger, for a VC-backed company, what is the one thing that EU Inc. Should make possible that national company laws currently make difficult? Because if I understood correctly what Vasco was saying, basically, if the problem is in the scaling up moment, probably the lack of integration in capital markets is much more relevant than the amount of paperwork you have to face at the beginning. So what will change, or would potentially change with the EU Inc.?
So let me just start by saying, so I'm much more in Rebecca's camp. So we both like necklaces. So therefore, it's clear that we're sharing not only style-wise, but also in other respects. But let me just respond to your question. So I think that one thing, if you look at venture capital markets in Europe, then if you look at the agents, particularly at the venture capital funds, you will not necessarily find venture capital funds who define themselves as French, as German, or whatever. They are European. So they look for investment opportunities across Europe simply because the market otherwise is just too small. So therefore, I think capital market integration as a bigger topic is maybe not such an issue if it comes to venture capital investors. Now, what's the one problem that needs to be solved? I think corporate laws have to be flexible, because we know from research that what venture capitalists and founders are actually doing when they agree on founding rounds essentially is they shapeshift the corporate form to something that fits their needs. And now corporate law has to be hospitable towards that exercise. And that is the key issue, because typically corporate laws in continental Europe are not hospitable to that sort of private ordering. And therefore, if EU Inc. solves something, then it is exactly creating the leeway, the maneuvering space for that kind of private ordering. And I think that's the real key that should be achieved through EU Inc.
Okay, and the same question from a different perspective to José Garrido. So, is this just the first building block of something bigger, or should we think that this should be a problem solver by itself? So, I mean, EU Inc. should be something that works regardless what is the largest project, because as we saw in the Capital Markets Union and in other very ambitious project, if you fix too much, if you think too much to the big picture, then the single pieces simply don't work.
Oh, thanks a lot, Stefano, and very pleased to participate in this colloquium with you. Just to clarify, I'm in the legal department of the IMF, and I'm actually representing on this event the European department, because there is an upcoming paper that will analyze the economic implications of the 28th regime. So I'm collaborating with that team from a legal point of view, but you will see that actually the IMF will show very detailed economic projections of what the effects of this regime could be. On your question, I think one of the biggest problems in the European Union across history has been the cascading. So this idea that in order to move to a different area, you still need to perfect something that's been in progress. It doesn't really work, because I think colleagues have mentioned the capital markets union, but we could even talk about the banking union. So a lot of these initiatives are not completed, and that should not be an excuse not to move forward in other areas. So for us, I think if you ask me what is the one problem that this regime should be solving, and if I have to name a single problem, I would say that the problem is the absence of a trusted, portable legal identity for European firms that want to operate across the EU. So cheaper incorporation matters, but I think it's a second order issue, because in many member states, it's already easy to incorporate fast and inexpensively. More flexible company law, I agree, is valuable, but it's a means and not an end. And investor confidence is an outcome rather than a problem statement. So the core dysfunction that we see in the European Union is that when a firm decides to operate across more than one member state in several modalities, it's extremely complex. And there's inconsistent treatment of assets, of financing instruments, and obligations when in distress. So this is what the 28th regime should solve. Create a single legal entity governed by a single rulebook, automatically recognized in all 27 member states. And that should operate through the whole life cycle of the firm. So everything else, lower costs, investor confidence, flexible capital structure, that follows from solving that problem well.
Thank you. Giovanni, you have the final word in this first round. And as we heard from the other speakers, there is always this ambiguity that is not entirely clear whether this 28th regime is something designed for startups or something that is designed for companies that is particularly useful for startups. Because as José Garrido was saying, it should be something useful for the whole life cycle of the company, so not just for the very early stages. So what kind of problem is trying to solve?
I think that it's very important to say that the proposal provides more flexibility. Flexibility is quite important. If you look at legal capital or governance system, there is a very much flexibility. This is something important for all companies, I would say. Also, Maribel Sainz said before, this is very useful not only for venture cap, for startup and scale up, but also for other companies. But at the same time, I am not sure that providing more flexibility will lead to harmonization. This is probably the one of the main limitations of the proposal. And another limitation is that flexibility is good, but too flexibility can be dangerous. And I see that there is a huge problem, for example, in the possibility for the e-wing to access the capital markets, because there is this very ambiguous rule that according to which member states must allow the wing to access the MTF. I agree on this, but they can allow the wing to access the regulated market. And this is something that, in my view, can be disruptive, because this will lead to the end of the divide between public and private companies. This can harm investor confidence. This is harmful not only for venture capital and startups and scale up, but also for the market in general. So I think that we care about these details that are not particularly in the spotlight, but are very important in order to achieve a balanced solution that can be useful mainly for startup, scale up, but also for other companies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that leads us directly to the following question, which is who would actually use it? Who do we expect that is trying to use this 28th regime? And that is something that I would like to ask to Vasco. If you can, I would not say name a specific company, but if you have in your mind the kind of company that is just waiting for this opportunity to start a new path that would be otherwise prevented to take, if it exists. If it is too difficult to give, to imagine someone who might profit from it, maybe we have a problem.
Well, I would start by saying that I think I repeat what I said, right? I think the Ewing, if we'll see what's the end of these negotiations. If it's to be used, if it's chosen voluntarily by founders, it's going to be mostly for those that are thinking to, or in a situation where they need to scale their company. The thing is that once you've found a startup, right, that's always the idea. You want to go through this journey from idea to exit. And of course, scale is really relevant to have a good exit. And so indeed, this could be potentially for any kind of company. I think we could expect that more startups that are not, for example, in the regulated markets will be more active in this front, right? For example, now we have a good example with AI startups. But indeed, the proposal keep it open for all types of companies. So the question is more if the other companies, more traditional companies, see an advantage in using this, and if it makes sense. But I think for fast-growing companies, as the ones that we represent, I think this is probably going to be used. Then there's also the question that I think is also not being asked enough, because the proposal allows also for formation of new companies through conversion, and there the proposal doesn't say much. It says it's possible. Nobody knows how it's going to be. What about those startups that are already in the market and those that scale already, let's say to 2-3 member states? Are they going to choose to sort of reincorporate or like to convert to a Ewing company? It's also a question we don't know. But indeed, I would say that for startups, this will link with the capacity to scale, not having to reincorporate again. And then, of course, there's other parts of the proposal that are relevant for these companies when it comes to this decision. Everything that is related to the multiple share classes, the fact the shares are dematerialized and they can be transferred digitally, convertible instruments. And one element of proposal that is going to be really, really attractive for these companies is the employee stock options. So this regime indeed has been something that's been asked by the startup community for a long time. And I think here also this will lead to companies to go for this option. Just the last thing, indeed, incorporation is very different in different member states for this type of companies. I think that there will be here an element of choice that is also by comparison to what is not in the proposal, right? Because at the end of the day, not only what is written in this proposal will matter for these companies, but everything else that was left outside. And this will also have an influence in the decision these companies will take when opening their company.
Mhm. And Rebecca, do you have any hint of what is the Commission expectation of the adoption of this regime? What do they have in mind? Because I see that in the press release, von der Leyen especially mentioned startups, technology companies. But is that the only target? What feeling do you have about this?
As we just heard, the rhetoric is all around innovative companies with technology, maybe that aren't very capital intensive, that just want to get their idea out there and start the company. There is criticism of this on all sides. The people who are really pro creating a special regime only for innovative companies, however you describe that, will say, oh, if it's open to all, then immediately it's useless because it won't be able to be specific enough to how we think it should go. And in the regime zero proposal from a couple of my Bruegel colleagues that I was not involved with writing, they say this should be specifically small companies where people get paid principally in stock. That's how they define it. But then other people say, well, what's the point of this thing if you can't use it? Then you have the legislative process, which is they have to approve it, and then individual countries have to sign on to it. At least 9 have to start out. I mean, there's different hurdles along the way. The stock options thing is interesting because a long time ago, I found a proposal kicking around the internet for specifically a 28th regime only on the stock option stuff and not with all the rest of this. So almost the fact that that's getting bundled, I wonder if it'll get lost in the shuffle, but it'll be interesting to see how it shakes out.
Mhm. And maybe José, Garrido, and Giovanni, I have the same question for both of you, which is who should start to trust this 28th regime force? I mean, lawyers, founders. I mean, we heard that for founders, for the startup community, this has quite an appeal and it's something relevant, but they're not the only players on the field. So, José Garrido, what do you think are the main hurdles from a lawyer's perspective or for bank perspectives? I mean, who do you think can raise the most relevant objections and maybe slow down the adoption process, or on the other side to speed it up?
So I think the both questions are a bit related because it depends on who's going to use it, and that also determines who is going to be opposed to it, and who are the main actors that can delay or block this initiative. I think in our own analysis, probably some member states are going to be not to say blocking, but maybe delaying this as much as possible. And I'm not going to mention for obvious reasons which states are these, but I think pretty much everybody has in mind several member states with quite developed company law regimes that actually don't stand to benefit as much from this, in the sense that the use of their corporate regimes by other European companies could diminish. So I think there's going to be a group of countries, and I think this is almost already identified by the Commission, that are going to be playing hard in the negotiations. And then I think there's no secret. I think there's going to be a very strong opposition from labor and trade unions. The main concern, of course, is that this regime will be used for regulatory arbitrage, and this is being the perennial problem in EU company law harmonization, the issue of worker co-determination and participation mechanisms. So I think the Parliament and the Commission have different positions on this, and I would expect the Council to have a different position too. And I think it's going to be a very, very difficult point to navigate, and I would expect probably the maximum opposition here. Finally, I think tax authorities and finance ministries are also quite concerned because they may resist any erosion of national tax jurisdiction. I was a bit surprised to find one tax provision in the Commission proposal, which it may cause a lot of legal problems just because of that article in the regulation. So I think probably these three groups are the ones that are going to create more difficulties in the process. But I think from the point of view of how trust needs to be earned, I think it also affects how the regime is designed. And in that respect, I think connecting with the original problem that needs to be solved, I think this regime should be open to all kinds of companies, but the ones that are going to use it are probably startups and scale-ups, those that have the ambition of operating at a European level. I think multinationals are not going to use it, at least at the beginning, because they have the resources to navigate all the complexities, and this could be a high risk. I mean, it's much more predictable for them to use what they've been using. And then for small companies, local companies, I don't think it's worth it unless the local company law regime is so dysfunctional that the 20th regime offers a good alternative. And then we can see some really interesting competitive dynamics. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Giovanni, as we heard from José Garrido, regulatory arbitrage is a problem because it can slow down the adoption because member states and many other actors profit from regulatory arbitrage. But I mean, introducing a new opportunity for regulatory arbitrage by design can create those opportunities. So do you think that there would be some people who will see this opportunity to have a new option as something that is in their interests, and they will create some form of coalition to push for the adoption? As as Ireland profited from fiscal arbitrage, and the Netherlands from corporate law loopholes and so on. So this can create a whole new level of opportunities, also because it can create regulatory arbitrage. What do you think?
Yeah, really, I don't know exactly what will happen, but I see I can bring some anecdotal evidence, and I found navigating online, finding in order to find some information on the project, some memos prepared by legal outstanding legal firms saying the wings is very welcome. It's very welcome because it's useful for a series of transactions. For example, could be useful to establish in a holding company, or maybe in a company when you have a takeover. So I think that this flexibility is welcome for this kind of transaction, maybe also for private equity, where the elimination of legal capital, the par value of the shares, the more flexibility in governance is something that can be very, very useful. So I think that there is a group of practitioners that probably is very much in favor of this EU Inc. But in order to meet this goal, probably you don't need a fully harmonized legal form, but 27 more flexible EU Incs are enough. That's my impression. For example, from the Italy point of view, we have a more rigid regime for the limited liability companies. So the WINC can offer, I think, room for more flexibility, but also for more maybe arbitrage. So I think that there are some group of interest that can push for this proposal, but I don't know if they are strong enough to push the proposal to the final approval.
Mm-hmm. Tobias, you have the final say for this round. So who do you expect will be the most vocal supporter of the 28th regime and beyond the startups community? I mean, do you expect someone that we are not thinking about?
not really. So, because I think you covered the universe already, I would just push a little bit against this idea that multinationals are not going to use that. So, at least in Germany, there's a strong lobbying effort from the stakeholders of the blue chips that they exactly want to have that. And they were pushing very strongly for opening up the legislative proposal beyond startup scale-ups in order to really organize their subsidiaries across Europe in a uniform manner. So you may want to that. I just want to add one additional point. I think we should not necessarily ask so much about who's going to use that, but we could actually ask, so who should use that? And the thing is that the benchmark should be, are we retaining corporations that reincorporate in Delaware? Because they have the opportunity, they're looking for capital, and they are strong enough to scale up in Delaware. Are we retaining them in Europe? Because that has massive welfare implications later down the road, not immediately because it's just a shift of your incorporation venue, but ultimately that is something that is also relevant for capital formation. And there, I think that's the question that we should ask. And here, I'm significantly more skeptical, and I hope we have an opportunity to discuss that.
Yeah, why? So you have the opportunity to discuss that now. So why are you so skeptical that this can compete with Delaware? Because the Delaware comes out so often that we need to face it directly at this
All
point.
right. So when I'm rolling, so the thing is that what is the choice variable that you are making if you reincorporate as an EU Inc.? You're using an unseasoned legal form where you don't really know what judges are going to do with that. You have zero network effects, meaning you don't have any case law that tells you anything about this. So it's a jump into very cold waters. And therefore, the benefits have to be massive in order to go for a little bit more cumbersome process, because you have to reincorporate across the Atlantic, but you very well know what you get in Delaware. Whereas EU Inc. is somewhat of, you don't really know. And therefore, I would say that the benefits of the regime, in order to make it the choice of incorporation, have to be significant beyond what we are discussing, these like more marginal improvements towards, or vis-a-vis the national regimes. And there I'm doubtful, because I don't think that it gives you much, because there are all sorts of, and we've listed it in our papers, there are all sorts of problems there. For example, you have the default rule that if it's not really regulated by the EU Inc. Statute, by the regulation, then you're falling back on national laws. There are all these fairness things that are there, which are not very hostile towards the typical type of venture capital contracting, and therefore the substance of the EU Inc. proposal is somewhat mixed, and therefore the lacking network effects are something that I think make it very unattractive. And then, last point, what can come out of this is an adverse selection. All the great companies that have scale up needs go to Delaware. Those that are failing, they just fail nationally. That's fine. And all these half okay-ish companies are just incorporating as EU Inc., giving it a very, very bad reputation.
Yeah, Rebecca is raising her hand to react to your gloomy scenario that you painted. Rebecca?
I don't disagree, actually, on the network effect stuff. And that's one reason why some people have been saying, well, if we have freedom of establishment in the EU, why not just make Estonia or someplace the Delaware of Europe, and everybody goes there and it's predictable and it's set. Where I do think EU Inc. will be helpful is for really small and really new businesses. I was just reading an article about an American woman who moved to Italy for personal reasons, and while she was there, decided to start up a dog grooming business. And where she was in Italy, she had a hard time getting registered with a tax number and all that stuff, because people were like, your business is going to do what? Nobody does businesses like that. Like, what's your point? And so if you're truly a one person shop or a really small business with a new idea, it might be nice to just go online and pay your $100 and have your corporate number the next day and start doing the thing, as opposed to having to hire people, notaries, whoever, to go sort through all this stuff for you. So my general take on the EU Inc. proposal is that, depending on how it turns out, it might be okay. But these businesses are, by their very nature, very, very small, 1 and 2 people, maybe not going to scale up, which is, you could say, counter to the intent of the proposal. And going to José Garrido's point about the employees and the unions and the labor law aspects of this. I mean, if you're working with really small companies that are just not ever going to hire people on a big scale, you don't run into the same trouble, but then you don't get the economic growth in the jobs.
Yeah, that sounds familiar to the Italians in the audience, because whenever you introduce special rules for very small companies, then you create an incentive for companies to remain small, like the case that Rebecca was presenting. But as Tobias was saying, you need, if you want to compete with Delaware, you need to have to offer huge incentives. So I would like to ask to Jose Garrido something that Sylvie Rohr was asking in the chat. So what could be those massive benefits? Tax heaven? Are we reintroducing from the window what we are trying to push back from? I mean, trying to harmonize Irish taxes and all this stuff that we all know very well. So is it that the real issue, that we are creating something for fiscal arbitrage or not?
No, I don't think so. I think again, and I would like to refer to the work of my colleagues from the European department. What we have in Europe is the biggest market in terms of spending capacity, and right now I think all of these new companies, they end up migrating because of these structural difficulties. So, but we have an immense market with immense possibilities, and this can be achieved better with the 28th regime. And why are these companies moving to Delaware? Because I think Tobias mentioned it's a much more predictable regime. So there's a lot of work to be done there. But it's also because the financiers wants the companies to be there. It's everything is more predictable from start to end. Now, this is what needs to be, it's a big challenge. This is what needs to be recreated in the European Union. But the European Union offers opportunities that are not being taken right now. I think there's at the Commission, there's a consensus that this is a problem that needs to be tackled. I think our own economic analysis proves that point too. Just to addressing a couple of points before, so what I said is that the multinationals would not be early adopters. I was not challenging that the multinationals are very interested in this. They are. They are pushing for the 28th regime. The big companies are pushing for the 28th regime. But as it's often the case, I think they would prefer that others do the experimenting. And probably only after this regime has a solid track record, they are going to be using it. But again, I think this is an interesting development, and in certain respects, I think Europe is trying to catch the last train here, because the productivity gap is becoming a real problem, and it's becoming bigger. And I think this, as many other initiatives, would be very important in trying to regain lost ground. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I would ask Vasco to address the labor union and the labor rights issue, because one of the most debated papers that we published with the think tank I work with was exactly related to this point by Oliver Coste and Jan Kontelem, and it was widely discussed also in Financial Times. Basically, they argue that if you want to promote innovation, you need to let innovative company to fire people more easily, because otherwise they can be limited by employment protection rules. So do you think that this will become something very controversial, how the EU Inc. Will deal with the labor rights, or is it something that is, I mean, unavoidable issue, but not the real point of the discussion?
Well, I would say that it's an important point of discussion, but as if you see from the proposal and even before the proposal was out, the same question was asked to the startup stakeholders. And we said we don't want to touch on labor law. And that's why it's not in the proposal. And it was the same thing we said on tax, because we knew this would be probably issue. I would not say that the argument goes as startups want to easily fire people. They actually want to easily hire people across borders. That's the big issue. And that's what they have to go through. I think that's, at least from what we hear from our members, that's been the big concern. And so we know that the council and the parliament are already sort of discussing this issue. We have been in contact ourselves with labor unions to try to sort of also to understand their perspective on this topic. I think, of course, we are not experts in labor law, so it's always harder to debate these issues with them. What we saw, there was also a lot of misconception around stock options because they tend to see stock options as an evil thing, whereas for startups it's a normal part of the business model, and it's a great way to attract talent to your company. So it's always been like this. But there will be here other points that will that we see already coming up in Brussels. I can just mention a few of them. One of the main points now being discussed in the institutions is the question about, or the concerns about, forum shopping, right? I think was sort of mentioned already. And some member states are going to try to put in more safeguards in the proposal to avoid that, of course, they lose their own founders. There's, of course, a specific case on co-determination that was already mentioned, especially with Germany, which has very specific rules on this. And that the proposal in itself has an article dedicated to this issue. There's questions about creditor protection, about insolvency, and so on. One of the big points that probably is not very visible in the proposal, and I think that it's a thing that we are now getting ready to fight for, is the question on the truly the freedom of establishment and the choice of seat and of operations. Because here, if you look at the proposal, it doesn't say there, but in theory that you should be allowed to have your headquarters in one place and operations elsewhere. That's basically what happens with Delaware in the US, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if that part is not there, then I would say that not even startups would use this this mechanism. And indeed, I have to go back to what Tobias said related to Delaware. I think for us, the point is we're not a startup community trying to reproduce the same model in Europe exactly. The idea was always like, can we do something that is competitive towards Delaware? And indeed, having a Delaware in Europe, as what was also mentioned today, like, okay, let's have really recognition of companies across Europe and everyone moves to Estonia. But we also are not there for that. I think the Commission made a proposal that will incentivize that, right? There's a race between member states to improve other areas that not company law to make jurisdictions to compete. And just to conclude, one thing that we have been saying around this, and I think this also plays on the question of labor law and others, is that the more the proposal would have been European, the less this competition would exist and this problem exists. The more member states and the parliament try to add safeguards and limit the scope of the proposal, the more founders and investors are going to compare and going to say, okay, this gives me, a company within 48 hours with the same label. It's recognized across Europe. Ideally, after some time, investors are going to trust it and founders use it. But then, where is the best business environment in Europe? Where should I go? Is it Luxembourg? Is it Estonia? And then they will do it. So I hope member states don't go in this fear logic of let's block every single thing in the proposal, because then they will probably lose their founders once the proposal is really operational.
And Giovanni, do you see this issue of trust? I mean, that we should start from somewhere. I mean, founders and should trust this proposal, but also member states should trust that this is something serious in order to create the environment around the EU Inc. Regime that will make it working. I mean, as an Italian, do you think that this will happen, or we have seen too many attempts to create special, how to say, um, special regimes to support innovation that at the end of the day became useless because the environment around allegedly innovative company was not shaped by this attempt.
Yes, I think that is the key problem, because I agree with José that probably the European Union is trying to catch the last train, because there is a serious problem in terms of productivity. But to solve this problem, probably you need more than a company legal form. So the WINC is a starting point, but it's not enough. You need a broader system that would be the 28 regime. So that implies also accounting law, labor law, tax law. But of course, the broader the scope of the project is, the stronger the resistance from member states are, I think. So that's the internal contradiction of the problem, because probably to create a European ecosystem that is not necessary only for startups and scale-ups, you need to harmonize all these areas of law. But I think that we will see some strong resistance, and maybe you say that is much more informed than me, said that there are some member states that are against this proposal, and I see the reasons, because maybe tax law and labor law are very, very sensitive for member states, much more than probably company law. So I think that at the end of the day, we will have a proposal that probably, yes, could be a first step, but probably will not solve the problem that has to solve.
Mm. And maybe I just have a follow-up for José Garrido, because one of the issues that always comes out and is at the center, for example, of paper by Luca Enriques and Casemiro and others, is that this tension between creating a special regime for startups and creating something that basically try to fix all the problem of the single market with one single tool leaves some loopholes that may create the risk to make this ineffective. So, I mean, maybe the question is too simple, but why did they choose this path? Was not a most effective tool to create something specific for innovative companies, since the main competitiveness gap with the US, the main productivity gap is just at the frontier of technologies, not in the rest of the economy. I mean, we do not need to speed up the automotive industry. We are not trying to fix the problem in the tourist industry. That was the problems we tried to fix in the 90s, not now. So why did they choose this approach?
Thank you. I think there are several problems that we put together, and it makes analysis a bit more difficult. Indeed, there's a big problem in the startups in technology. I think there's this famous chart that shows with bubbles the big technological companies in the US and the companies in Europe in the tech sector, and it looks like you are comparing planets and footballs. So it's actually quite shocking. But I disagree that this is just a problem for the technological sector. This is a problem for all sectors. That there are many areas in which new companies are not able to benefit from the European internal market. I think this is the problem that the proposal is trying to solve, not the problem of the technological sector. I think if there's a regime that provides different rules for companies based on their sector, based on the fact that they are innovative, the problem that we've seen with that type of design is that it creates a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of uncertainty. Like, even founders do not know whether their company will be classified within that regime or not. And I think so. For that reason, I think the approach is better to approach this as a general system, and particularly focused for companies that want to expand across the EU. And I have to say that in years of working here, I've never seen so much political support from the top of the European institutions and also here at the fund. Thank you.
Okay, we have discussed of companies growing and how they manage exit and other positive outcomes, but what makes startups different that they often fail and they need to go through insolvency and restructuring procedures. So I would like to ask to Vasco, how do he sees this part of the 28th regime? Is it enough what is in the proposal or not?
Well, as I said in the beginning, the proposal is just really a first building block, right? I think one of the interesting potentials of this proposal, and here going back to the question of 28th regime and what are 28th regimes, right, is of everything else that will be left to be discussed in the coming years. I recently attended a seminar when the discussion was already not about the corporate layer, and it was about B2B contracts, for example, and other dimensions are coming up. So we'll have to see. I think now the question for us is how. So the level of ambition that the proposal has in itself from the Commission, and let's be honest here, I think the Commission already put something that is sort of coming from sort of a political compromise, right? They could not risk to put something on the table that would be completely rejected by both the Parliament and the Council. This process also had something very specific, as you have seen, that was the Parliament wrote an own initiative report on it before, so with the vast majority of MEPs voting in favor it, so already telling what they would like to see or not. So I think the Commission was very cautious in what they put forward. And once this is in place, and it will still take some time, we know that they want to finish negotiations by the end of the year, but there's still an implementation phase. Then I think other problems will have, we'll start new discussions, right? In other fields, I mean, of truly business law, right? Other fields within business law that have not been discussed. Because indeed here, one thing I agree very much with, which José was the point on the untapping the potential of the single market, which is there, but in several of its dimensions is not really working for European companies, being startups or not. And that's part of the problem that has to be addressed. We need to start somewhere. I think that if I would ask founders I talk with, they would love this proposal to solve every single problem that they have to face, because, they think about their company within months, right? They know that in 5 months they have to, because they're competing globally, right? So they need to move really fast. So ideally, but that's not how things work. So we'll have to wait and see. For now, we hope that the proposal is not further watered down. I think, of course, as it's a classic in Brussels, it will somehow. We get signals from the Parliament that they want as much as possible to keep whatever the Commission put there and add some elements. On member states, it's a different conversation where they want to go. But it's a paradox, right? Because then by the end of the day, we still have to hear them saying that Europe is not competitive enough towards, or like when compared to other regions. And again, if this is about scaling and it's about access to investment, and we're looking at this single market, I'm sorry, but we cannot fix European problems with national solutions, right? We need truly European solutions for this. And we are hoping that with all the data we have now, that member states start realizing that it's really time to do something together here. And then that they'll open for discussions for the next battles, because there will be other important elements to be solved for businesses in Europe that are not just this. So not the corporate layer, but the transactional layer, which is going to be interesting to see. Because we are probably the only big region in the world that does not have really common rules for business, right? And so we need to address those right after.
Mhm. Tobias, we mentioned many times that people should trust this e-ink in order to use it, but probably the moment when you see whether it works or not is exactly when insolvency legislation and other procedure kicks in. I mean, when you see whether the condition that you created at the moment of the incorporation actually are enforceable when things go wrong. So do you expect that this moment of truth will come maybe too late in order to create this trust, or otherwise, since startups fail quite often, I mean, we will see very early whether this EU Inc. is something serious or not.
Yeah, so I think the way you framed the question, I think there I can agree, because if the startup fails, it's not a big concern for the investors, because they understand that this is going to happen and then they just write it off. So that's not the problem. The problem is if you have a somewhat performing company but that it's not really blitz scaling, so it's not really a success story, and you want to get out of this. And that is where restrictions from insolvency law actually matter outside of insolvency law, because if certain transactions then are voidable because they might disadvantage some of the creditors or some of the other stakeholders, particularly, of course, labor, later down the road when the whole thing fails, then, your transactions are already impeded. And that's, I think, where it matters. And you're asking whether that's going to come quickly or not. I would say that's going to come relatively quickly. And then we're going to face a situation where insolvency law is not going to be harmonized in the relevant parts. And therefore, people will understand that this is essentially still, in very critical respects, a pretty national endeavor. And therefore, I think that this is highly problematic, although you have to start from somewhere. And therefore, I would echo what others have said in this, on this panel, that you cannot say because we want to have like 57 solutions to all sorts of problems, we don't start at all. So that's not the point. But I'm just saying there has to be some expectation management that this is a marginal improvement and it's not going to solve everything in a day. But of course, yes, these issues are there and they're on the table.
Rebecca?
Yeah. So I wanted to come back in on this question of complexity and how many problems are we trying to solve at once. Certainly, as Jose said at the beginning, the life cycle of these firms is the big problem. But when you come in with a policy, if you try to solve too many things at once, you end up solving none of them. So to me, that argues for making it more specific. I mean, already, if this thing doesn't go forward and we lose this stock option, employee-owned stock option thing that people have been pushing for 15, 20 years, I don't know that that is necessarily an advantage. With regard to insolvency law specifically, it's interesting to me that we're approaching this from the sense of how can we start up a whole new kind of company in law and all these things instead of just going after what happens when a company fails. Now, people will say, and the lawyers among you will say, yes, but it all goes back to how are you incorporated and what courts apply. But there might be other ways to do that. There might be arbitration agreements. There might be frameworks or contracts or things to say, like, if your deal goes sour, here's how you get out. Here's how you argue about how to split up what's left that can work with what we have and with the courts that we have. That's not in this proposal, but I think it would be interesting.
No, that's interesting. Giovanni, what do you think about that, and about more in general the role of insolvency rules, and I mean, how to manage a situation that are not the next OpenAI or the next Apple or something like that, but they are just the so companies that nobody wants to remain invested in forever.
Yeah. If I may, can I just follow up on what Rebecca said just now? Because I think
Yeah, absolutely.
yes, because I think that this alternative startups versus other companies, I don't think that is a necessary alternative, because the proposal now try to cover all companies, and that I think that can be possible because there are some rules that provide flexibility that is useful for all companies, or small companies at least, so eliminating legal capital, par value, or there are many other examples in the proposal that I think that are very useful. It can be useful for many companies also, because there are companies that need flexibility that are not tech companies. But at the same time, what probably is lacking in the proposal is something more specific for startups and scale up that can be added to the proposal, but it's not necessarily an alternative. I think that it's only a matter of designing the proposal in the right way. And now probably this is not the case. So I don't see this alternative because also it's very difficult to draw a line between tech companies or startups versus not startups. So I think that if you create this kind of definition is quite impossible to navigate, and you create another layer of complexity. That's my feeling. Also, the commission provided this recommendation on the definition of innovative companies, but it's not entirely clear, at least to me, to what this definition serves. There is the rule on the insolvency that is limited to the innovative companies, and that's to say something on insolvency is quite interesting that this specific rule is limited to innovative companies. So I think that the insolvency law is something that is very national. Mostly important is something that is very related to the national courts. So if you don't have a European course or for the EU Inc., I think that harmonization of the insolvency is pretty impossible.
You trigger a couple of reactions, Tobias, and then Jose.
Very, very quickly. So no one wants a definition of an innovative startup company and then endless bickering about who is innovative and who not. But the way to address the problem simply is by designing the substantive rules of the EU Inc. proposal targeted specifically towards those firms that are scaling up, that are starting up, and then you solve the natural selection problem by the take up, because then, regular firms just won't use that form. And then it's solved. You don't have to define who's going to be entitled to take it. And that's just the way to address that problem, I think.
Jose?
Thanks. No, I just wanted to say that the part on insolvency is the most disappointing part of the proposal, and I think there's a very clear explanation why. At the same time that the Commission was working on this proposal for the 28th regime, the Commission was trying to convince member states to adopt the insolvency directive. So it was kind of funny to see the pains through which the Commission staff members have gone, trying to, on the one hand, convince the member states to adopt yet another harmonization directive for insolvency, and at the same time saying, look, you know what, actually we're going to follow a totally alternative route, which is the 28th regime, which explains why in the end, what you have in the proposal seems actually the parts of the insolvency directive that were discarded by the council. So it's actually pretty strange. But the regime needs to be developed fully in order to have, if this 20th regime is going to have a serious effect. Because when we are talking about Delaware, I think many corporate law scholars are very familiar with Delaware corporations law. But it wouldn't work just as well without the US bankruptcy code behind. And I think that this is one of the effects that the financiers want to see. They want to know that when they have a deal with a company, there's an insolvency law, there's a bankruptcy law behind that actually could help them predict what's going to be the outcome. So if that is not present in the 20th regime, I think a lot of the positive effects evaporate. And the reason is that access to finance by these companies will be severely restricted. So we believe it's a very important problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for adding this. If we try to project us in the near future, let's say in 5 years, how do you assess the success or failure of this experiment? I would like to start with Rebecca again. How do you think we will assess this 28th regime in 5 years? In terms of the number of companies that incorporated in this way, or just the kind of companies, or maybe other, or the number of member states, or whether the notaries will be involved in a way or not, or if they will come back in some ways.
So I am pessimistic that we get to the point where your question works out. This assumes, first of all, that we get a proposal through. And second of all, that countries say that they're going to do it, actually go through with doing it and making it available. We've seen with the Pan-European Personal Pension Product, which was supposed to solve a lot of similar sorts of cross-border and portability and compatibility problems, that even though this thing ostensibly is a directive that every member state can sign up for, not all of them have. It doesn't exist in all member states. Where it does, there's maybe one provider. I mean, it's really a limp program. And I could see EU Inc. ending up in a very similar situation where you get some kind of Franken legislation that makes it through, that countries then very lackadaisically incorporate into their own laws, and it ends up being, really only used in very specific niche situations. I mean, to me, a success would be if all the prospective solo businesses out there could cut through the paperwork and do all the permitting. Given tax authorities and the way they protect their jurisdictions, I don't think that's possible. But let's say this thing gets through in under a year, and let's say everybody incorporates it. Even if the only people who ever use it are 1- and 2-person businesses, I think that would look good.
Okay. Vasco, what do you think? I mean, if not 5 years, maybe 10 years. So if we extend the time span, maybe we can get
That's
to an
too long.
assessment. Okay.
10 years is too long for startups, right? It needs to be faster. And look, I think success in this particular case would mean that EU Inc. could become a natural company form for cross-border European startups and scale-ups. And that indeed it could become a competitive standard, as Delaware is, by competing with this form and others, so that indeed startups and scale-ups can be companies that can be founded and can grow within the single market, and that they can compete globally from Europe without having to flip as they normally do to the US. That we can attract very high-level investments to Europe, that we can have much more intra-EU investment because it's very low now, cross-border investment. And then we can also attract companies from other regions who want to move to Europe. I think the question on the number, how many will incorporate, I think the proposal, the impact assessment has some estimation, but it's very conservative numbers. I think, in the incorporation, when we look at startups, it could happen. It's enough that company national forms are too expensive and ineffective that they could use this, right? I think the question is, how many unicorns will stop moving to US? Because now they're all I think 40% or more are moving there. Can we finally, as is the case of the US and also China, have our first $1 trillion company? Because we don't have one right now. So can we catch up at this level and have really big companies in Europe? So I think those are the ones that we will be looking at as success cases. So hopefully, yes.
Now, just a clarification for what you said about the unicorn and the $1 trillion companies. But how this could be related to the 28th regime? You mean that some company, a company that does not exist yet, will incorporate with the 28th regime and will become a 1 trillion company in a few years? Would be the measure of success.
That could be the case, right? Because right now, if you look at how long it takes to scale in Europe, if you have to incorporate in 10 member states, how complicated it is. If that starts being easier and you have access to this 450 million citizens market, right? And you can scale and be much bigger and faster in Europe, then why not? It could be a criteria to look at it as a success, because indeed we don't have those companies in Europe. And let's be honest, probably a lot of scale-ups that had a potential to become even I don't know, I think the most successful case we have probably right now is Spotify, right? To have a certain amount of even billion euros, those left. Those are not European companies anymore. Those are American companies. So I think this would be something we should look at. Again, of course, if we have great numbers of incorporation of small companies joining, I think it's fantastic. But I think the goal is really to give them access to a level of scale that we can really retain all this value within the European economy that we are losing every year. because either they leave or they fail because they cannot scale enough to compete with similar companies in other regions and countries.
Jose, how do you assess this problem in your work and the paper you mentioned before? I mean, is it the number of companies that we are looking for, or just the unicorns and the next Spotify that will define the success or failure of this experiment?
Thank you. I think I agree with Vasco that it's going to be more about the quality of the companies than the number of registrations, and I think it's necessary to measure all economic variables here. I mean, it's a very complex exercise, but this is what the commission should be doing after a few years. This initiative is in place. I think it should be in place. And I also want to highlight another point, and is that we also need to take into account that there may be side effects and side benefits to this initiative. So imagine that in the end, this 20th regime is adopted, and there's a limited number of registrations, but this moves European company laws in a certain direction. So there's more flexibility in European company laws. There's less barriers. There's more possibilities for financing arrangements, for stock options, because European company laws decided to move along those lines. And this could be the same also for other areas. So in that respect, I mean, do not underestimate the effect that the 20th regime may have as a force that catalyzes changes in the other areas and in the national laws of the EU. And I think that would be very important too. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And Tobias, what's your
So
future
let me
assessment?
just introduce a very crisp measure of success. If you look at the stock indices like the S&P 500 and the Russell 2000, you will realize that 50 years ago, they were entirely different companies. If you look at similar indices in Europe, you will see a lot of static, it's essentially the same companies there. And the success metric that I suggest is if we see in like 5 years, 10 years, in these indices, more companies that weren't up there like 5 years, 10 years ago, then this proposal has achieved something. And I'm saying this deliberately because I don't necessarily think that all these successful companies have to incorporate as a EU Inc. in order to make that initiative a success. Echoing what Jose just said, it may be just a point of reflection for national legislator. How can we improve our corporate law to make it more hospitable towards innovative firms? And if that's the catalyst effect that the EU Inc. proposal has, even if there's zero take-up, then it's great. And this should be measured by the metric that I'm suggesting.
Mm-hmm. Giovanni, you have the final word about what's your personal measure of success or failure?
I don't have a measure, but I agree that one possible positive outcome of this proposal would be the pressure on national legislation in order to improve the national laws. For example, I hope that the Italian legislator will learn something from the EU proposal, at least regarding the cross company, because I think that is a quite important model that can inspire national lawyers. But I imagine three different scenarios. The first one is the negative, or maybe the less positive. We have the wing like a corporate vehicle that can be useful for some transaction, maybe can facilitate some acquisition, private equity. That could be something good, but probably it's not the best scenario. The best scenario could be the one mentioned by Vasco and Jose. So have a company that's particular, the company that need to scale up, able to raise money all around the member states. And the worst case scenario, in my opinion, is that it will be only a vehicle to circumvent national laws. That would be really the worst outcome I can see at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I don't know if you have any other something you want to say to add. Otherwise, I will turn to Luca for moderating the Q&A. I don't know. You're fine. You're good. Okay. So thanks so much. It was extremely interesting to me to participate in this workshop and especially
Thank you,
to this
Stefano.
panel. And I apologize I cannot stay until the end, but I'm sure that Luca will moderate much better than me the Q&A. And okay, thank you so much, and I hope we have other opportunities to discuss hopefully the success of the 28th regime. Otherwise, to discuss why it failed. But we have, I mean, as Rebecca said, it's not a matter of a few months or 5 years, probably. Okay, thanks again. Bye bye to everybody.
Excellent discussion. Leadership skills were shown here today. So I take over, and perhaps I can do what Stefano would have done if he didn't have to leave, which is say some kind of concluding remarks before leaving the floor open for questions and discussion. So my impression, especially towards the end of the panel, was that corporate law has a self-esteem issue. So self-esteem is the ability to judge how much your value is, or how what your value is, and if you have no clue, you go from a moment in which you say I'm worth nothing to a moment after you say I am the best in the world. And the discussion about how to judge the success of the EU Inc. reminded me that kind of person, because we went from if there are more unicorns, if there are more giant tech-listed companies in Europe, then the EU Inc. will be a success. To arguing that corporate law is relevant, yes, but insolvency law, employment law, tax law, that would be where the area where game changers would materialize, and therefore we shouldn't put so much reliance on corporate law. So which one is it? Is corporate law really capable of leading Europe from where it is now, which is almost in a state of desperation in terms of innovation and technology, innovation, etc., to a place at the same level as China and the US, or are we in fact giving too much weight to these issues? That's a question that I leave open. Of course, I don't want you to respond, but I would. So that was a comment. I would leave the floor now open for anyone who wants to either ask questions or give their own contribution to this debate. So Marco, please.
Yes. Okay. No, thanks. I mean, it's as an external observer on corporate law, I can, I don't think that there is too much of a self-esteem problem, but I think it's. I found all this very, very interesting and refreshing, and also giving me a new perspective. I just wanted to bring back one issue about the way that we think about these things. And getting back also to when we had Paul was doing his presentation, and he mentioned the fact that what I had said at the beginning is that if I can make a criticism, okay, to kind of this legal way of thinking, is that kind of you seem to be taking things a lot as fixed. And instead, I mean, if we change the rules, things will change, okay? And I was making the example of 1996 Blue Sky Laws elimination in the US, which created a national market for venture capital. And so kind of in that sense, I mean, I think that we should think beyond that, okay? Kind of having an idea that if we think, if we change the way that the legislation is structured, then behavior will change. And so when I was proposing, clearly that was a provocation, kind of the Netherlands, or kind of one jurisdiction as a potential seed. Then, I mean, I was happy that Paul was picking up the fact that this may allow for a harmonization of contracts and of contracting practices, which might generate a larger flow of money and an easier flow of money, decreasing also the cost. So we have to, in that sense, we have to think beyond what is the structure now. I think that's kind of something that I certainly took away from today's interesting discussions. So that was my main point. Kind of generating new ways of interactions will change behavior, and so we should not take behavior as just given. And also, kind of, at a certain point, Tobias was saying, "Hey, kind of, yes, we are going to lose to Delaware in a way because the cost benefit is very unfavorable." Yes, that is true, but kind of my point would like to be a little bit more optimistic, and we can change that by changing the fundamental elements of the equation, and so that we can get to a better outcome. Obviously, Delaware will remain very, very attractive for many, for some companies. But I mean, we can generate a little bit of competition and maybe even attract US-based, what are now kind of US-based startups by changing fundamentally. And I think that the harmonization by creating economies of scale, specialization of intermediaries, and kind of can even create a force to overcome those resistance by monopolies that kind of by the stakeholders, the gatekeepers, kind of like notaries and so on, that clearly are negative. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a great experience.
Thank you, Marco. Does anyone want to react to that from the panel or from the audience? Because so if not, I would like to ask again to the panel or to the remaining people in the panel what I asked Paul before. So what are the competitive advantages of say Dutch EU Inc. compared to Dutch BVs? If we focus on scale-ups and not just at the very beginning, small mom and pop shops, etc., but at the scale-up moment, leaving aside the Delaware flip as an option, why would someone choose the EU Inc. And not the Dutch BV, which may actually be more flexible than the EU Inc.? Does anyone want to respond to that? Yes, Vasco.
I would react to your question, but also to the previous comments. I think a bit of everything. On your first comment, there was about the role of company or corporate law. The way I see it, and here I can be a bit idealistic, is that it's a bit like the cornerstone or the foundations of a big cathedral, right? I think everyone goes to visit the cathedral for the beautiful stained glass windows and pinnacles, but you cannot have it without a foundation. So again, I think here company law has probably a less stunning role to play than other parts that people are describing during this discussion, but that is foundational and it's needed because that's where you start building your company. So I think it's still very relevant. And on the comment from Marco and on Delaware, I mean, I'm also positive here because from the conversations I've been having with founders in Europe, like I'm now currently in Malta for a tech conference, and I was speaking about EU Inc. this morning to a full room of mostly very young startup founders. And they are really looking for an alternative. Most of them don't want to build their companies in the US. They want to do it in Europe. They just need the right conditions to have, their companies to succeed and compete with other regimes around the globe. So I think here we can have like expectations. Then for your question on the BV in the Netherlands, I mean, again, I think this goes back to something we addressed today. That is, of course, if we would have exactly a Delaware in Europe, meaning that I open my company in Lisbon and it's automatically recognized across Europe, then then you would not be having this discussion probably, and we would all be looking for the best place to go. I think if you are a Dutch BV and your goal is not to stay within that market and is to expand. Probably the closest market you'll think about next is Germany, which probably is a nightmare to start your company. So if it's a Ewing company, and indeed if this becomes a standard and investors recognize this, and it's much easier to do a right risk assessment of investing in your company because, okay, we know what a Ewing is, what are the standard articles of association and the rules that apply, then probably could be more attractive to go, if you're just starting, to go already for Ewing than start as a BV, because then you still have to reincorporate 27 times across the market. So probably it could be, but it also depends what you want to do with your company, right? So it depends on your own experience and what sort of company this is, right? If it's a startup that wants to grow really fast across Europe, then probably Ewing is going to be easier than checking, every single company law with lawyers and so on and so on. It's one. At least you hire lawyers once to understand it, and that should be enough.
I'll come back to this, but now Tobias and then José.
For discussion to be fun, there needs to be some blood. So I disagree. So I think portable legal personality is a marginal improvement, which is nice to have, but doesn't really matter. So if your premises, so it's all with models, right? So if your premises holds, Luca, that the Dutch BV is significantly more flexible and gives you everything that you need, no one will incorporate it as an Ewing. Doesn't make sense. Because I think, I'm buying permanently from EU, from Dutch BVs permanently. I'm buying from Austrian companies. So scaling your business across Europe doesn't necessarily involve a lot of corporate law issues, I think. So therefore, I'm not convinced that this portable legal personality really is the big issue. And other than that, you have it. You can have Associates Européen, which no one likes.
Okay, then José.
Thank you so much, Luca. And I was really amused by your comment about the self-esteem of corporate law scholars. I think there was one time where people discussed the end of corporate law and that corporate law had no function or meaning. So I think it's good to have these discussions. I think corporate law definitely has a place within the functioning of the economy and within competitiveness for sure. But we also need to recognize its limits. So company law cannot make miracles, and we need to consider the company law within the broader context of the law. Now, on your question on the example about the Dutch company versus the 28th regime company, I think it's totally different. I mean, I don't think that the Dutch company is going to give you what the depth of the internal market would give you, because we have to think about very complex operations that we don't see nowadays, and we should wonder why. Like, for instance, imagine that the best software developers are in the Czech Republic, but then you have wonderful manufacturing facilities in Denmark. And then you have access to some type of organizational structure in France. I mean, how do you combine that? I mean, it's so difficult. So the idea that you can have a company, and this is the way that things work here in the US, that you can have companies that actually, where they have manufacturing in Texas, but actually all the administration of the company is in in New York, for instance, and actually the only thing that they have in Delaware is a rented postal office. So this is what really benefits and creates a lot of synergies that we cannot even see right now. So I do believe this is a very, very different and fundamental approach that we should be testing. And I would like to say also that I don't really see the 28th regime as a silver bullet, but I see it as one of the last bullets that the EU has left. So in a sense, it's both more optimistic and both more pessimistic. Thank you.
Thank you, José. That was a nice analogy. Giovanni.
Yes, very briefly about the BV versus weak. But I think that based on the proposal we have now, I don't see many difference, to be honest. I think that the BV is very flexible, provide a grade of flexibility very similar to that of the Wink. Probably the advantage that the Wink can provide, but if the proposal we change is that you have some templates for funding, for raise money all around Europe. And then I think that will be very important, because I don't think that for German investors it's very important to understand how the company is designed. I think that for the German investors it's very important to understand the condition of the financing. That's enough. I think that if you have this kind of harmonization, that will be enough to make the wing more effective. But that's my probably pessimistic view.
Thank you, Giovanni. I saw Marco first.
No, just very quickly, building on what Giovanni was saying. Yeah, the BV versus EU Inc. I see this mostly from the point of view of the investors. If they can deal with a simplified, unified set of rules, that might kind of help them, encourage them to invest much more. So kind of that's it's not just a decision of the entrepreneur, but also, and maybe even more importantly, of the investor. That's all I want.
Yeah. Thank you. Alessio from the Netherlands.
Yes, from the Netherlands, but not an expert of Dutch law. I think the question, I noticed the question that Luca posed this earlier today, and it's motivating this heated discussion now. And I'm actually struggling with it. I don't have an answer, but I would like to bring something that I know from working alongside Dutch corporate law scholars. First of all, Dutch corporate law scholars are those who manage corporate law, which is very different from what you can read and we can translate. So that's a body of case law that shapes also the way they look at corporate lawyer, look at corporate law, and it's very idiosyncratic. So that's why I'm struggling with answering the question, Luca. I don't know the answer because I'm not a Dutch corporate law scholar. I'm close to them, so I discuss some aspects, I discuss with them, and I've written something that I actually share with Luca. So Luca knows where I'm going to, and I think from my understanding of the consistency between case law and statutory law here in the Netherlands, that one way forward for the EUINC would be to attach a EU specialized court managing the interpretation of the EUINC. And I see this as a fundamental issue that is missing from the discussion. And in my opinion, my understanding, and although I don't have certainty of this, is that also would give strength to corporate law and BV as a vehicle for startup scale-up financing, which happens here. Perhaps not only because of corporate law, but it works pretty well here. And the courts have been able to strike a balance between what's written in the rules, what private ordering can do, and the general clause that the open norms or general clause that the courts systematically use to protect constituency from abuse, particularly minority shareholders. And they've been doing this consistently, just based on norms of fairness and reasonableness. And this is something that requires lawyers and counsel to be deeply embedded in the local system. So I doubt whether something has been said before that investors from other countries that are not familiar with Dutch corporate law would be comfortable with using a BV without being familiar with how a BV is adjudicated by Dutch courts. And perhaps also founders, to the extent that they have conversations with their legal counsel on how to shape their rights and obligations.
Okay, thank you, Alessio. I see Maria.
Yes, hello. So maybe I have a question for Vasco. If I see your point as saying that we need this because growing startups need to reincorporate to reach all the different European countries. Now, coming from Spain, we are a medium, small size country with not so well developed capital markets, and yet we have huge multinational companies operating all over Europe and all over the world. And for example, this thing that Jose was saying about operating in different countries, I was thinking about, a Spanish listed firm, Amadeus, the headquarters are in Madrid, the database is in Germany, and the marketing people are in France. So, companies find ways of doing this in the European Union. I mean, I'm not saying that this doesn't need to be simplified and made easier, and that firms wouldn't go for this. But the way I see this is, do the firms need this, or is it a question of investment because of the investors? Because when I think about these large companies, they have grown over the years, and they have gone to the capital markets, and they have been growing incrementally. Yes, over many years. And I think the problem now is that you are thinking about a startup that goes from being a small company to a unicorn in 3 years. And that needs different type of investors. So maybe we could do a lot. Maybe working more on the fragmentation of capital markets. And then maybe we don't need to do that much for venture capitalists. I mean, I don't know. It's just an idea.
Thank you. Does Vasco want to respond to that?
Yes, I mean, I can only speak in the quality of someone that works with startups and scale-ups, right? So I don't know in the concrete examples you're giving from the Spanish market. I mean, I can imagine, I think every time I think about Spain, probably I think about Inditex, right? And Inditex and Zara were created in 1975. So they reached this global scale in a certain timing, right? As all traditional big multinationals. But for the type of companies we work with, the goal is really to go really fast, or as fast as possible. And so for them, from the point of view of scaling, okay, I see, of course, this is not the only fundamental question about opening your company. I mean, again, if you look at Spotify, which is also a very specific case because it's a platform, right? It's not like an industrial startup. They had to reincorporate in all member states, and they did it. So indeed, there's a question on the investment side, right? About having a standard that is recognized by investors that facilitates the decision to put money in these companies. We could also argue that there are other things there. Tobias, for example, mentioned Societies Europaea, but Societies Europaea, it was never meant for startups, right? It was meant for corporations and not for really fast-moving startups that are trying to incorporate quickly, raise venture capital, and scale. Plus, it has like a huge, a considerable minimum capital requirement that I think is like 120K, whereas here with Ewink, we're looking for something different. I don't think the discussion Ewink excludes, as I said today, many other discussions on capital markets union and, as I said, on the transactional layer, because then once these companies are operating, the day-to-day life of a company is not the articles of association, it's not the incorporation, right? It's about the contracts you sign with other companies or your clients. And there's other probably more relevant issues to solve. But what we see is that we already have a lot of even beginner startups in Europe that when funders are opening, they don't even open anymore in Europe. They already are looking for other regimes like Delaware, and they moved directly there. Or they're really easily attracted to this regime. So again, I agree with what was said today. Not a silver bullet, but an important layer to create a certain standard for these companies to facilitate attraction of capital. But just think. I've been in some events where actually scale-ups complain on the incorporation side. So it's not like a massive problem, but they struggle. And here is about velocity. If they really want to go really fast, reincorporating in different countries, and maybe costs could be residual, the time this takes, and in some member states is months, it's not compatible with this business model when your main competitors, let's say US and China, this is not the case. So then you're already losing.
Thank you. I would take the liberty of sharing my screen because I have a question for the lawyers in the webinar, which are a large majority. About, can you see this Article 103? Yes, okay. So Article 103 struck me as very surprising because it says, unless it is objectively justified and proportionate, member states shall treat EU Inc. companies no less favorably than other limited liability companies formed in accordance with their national law in any aspect of their activities and operations. So that struck me because it means that EU Inc. companies can be treated less favorably than other limited liability companies, so long as it is objectively justified and proportionate, which is the more or less, it's even less than the Gebhardt test. And I'm surprised to see that, because I would have thought that if you are an EU Inc., mutual recognition will apply, and that will be the end of any Gebhardt sort of obstacle to free movement. Whereas that's not the case. Perhaps this is political realism. Perhaps the European Commission knew that without this, it would never go through Parliament or the Council. But still, do you find that a small irrelevant detail, or is there something there that makes this endeavor less likely to succeed? Is it just me that sees something bad in there for the success of the EU Inc.?
So if I may, so I think this is an expression of, or it just, I would say, this is something that you give to the member states who are skeptical and say, look, if things get really bad, you can just still treat it. And that, I think, is something that has been already said on the panel, that there are some member states who just don't like that. And therefore, I think this is just a manifest evidence. It's manifest evidence of exactly that. Because I see this for the first time, but I cannot really imagine what this is for. I mean, treat them worse, right?
Maybe you couldn't treat them worse anyway, because the treaty may prevent you from doing that. But it's interesting that still you can come up with something that is so you can apply your own national company law, basically, to an EU Inc. that is incorporated in the Netherlands and operates possibly exclusively in your own country, which is the old inspired art kind of thing that was never actually overcome by the case of the European Union, which has, to some extent at least, made regulatory arbitrage less common than it would otherwise be. Because if it was an issue, then we wouldn't be talking about any of this, because we would have a European Delaware most likely already.
I think if you allow me, Luca, I think that this is one of the reasons why it's very rare that European rules are examples of best standards. And the reason is that in the end, there are so many rules that just reflect a compromise between two opposing lines of thought. So I think that that the French, the constructivists, will have a field day with this kind of text, because it's like there are principles that really are opposing each other. And this article is probably one of the best examples. I really cannot think of any rational justification for this, other than try to appease the fears of some member states.
Sorry, thank you, Jose. Who else would like to raise a new issue, an old issue, question, comment? We still have 59 participants, which is pretty impressive after 5 hours. And 5 hours in 1 minute. But we don't have necessarily to go forward until 6:30. We are not captive. And so if no one would like to add to the debate, I would leave the floor to Tobias, which the organizer, so me, Tobias, and Giovanni and Casimiro, whom I all thank, put on the spotlight for the final comments.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. So it's not going to be really a summary or a wrap up, which I'm going to present in the next 50 minutes. It's just a little bit. So let me just thank you all for participating in this, because I think it was a timely discussion. Many people said that, and I think it's accurate. And I think Luca already mentioned that we still have quite a significant size audience, but it was really huge. And Georg, in his presentation, mentioned that he was reminded of the COVID times, and still, these were not great times, but people were still going through this experience of having this online seminar. And I ascribe that to the great lineup of speakers, panelists, discussants. And therefore, I think that this is something that can be labeled a success, and we all hope that EU Inc. will also be a success. Simply because I think something that has been echoed in much of the discussion is this is sort of not the silver bullet, but it may be the last bullet. Because the thing is, José has said that he has rarely experienced so much political support for an initiative. And that capital, of course, can also be wasted. So if we come up with a lukewarm compromise now that doesn't really achieve what it's supposed to achieve, and that doesn't really improve on the economic output that Europe is generating and the innovation that we see in Europe, then, of course, this will further delegitimize the European institutions because they don't deliver. And therefore, I think our discussion is not only timely, but I think it's also pivotal for the future of Europe. And therefore, I thank you wholeheartedly for participating so actively and so astutely with your interventions. And the last thing that I have to say is, of course, it's not only the organizers. We don't do that alone. We do that with a lot of administrative support. And there were people from the European Corporate Governance Institute, the ECGI, so Elaine McPartland, Suzanne Harley, who have been very instrumental in that. And here in Frankfurt, setting everything up, Miriam Ducati and Alexander Dirking, who have been great as always. And therefore, without them, not the seminar would have happened, and our tiny contribution to saving Europe would not have happened, and that would have been very bad. So thank you all for participating, for your great interventions. Join us again for the next event when we're going to save Europe again. Thank you so much.